Welcome to Biology of Marine Mammals. I'm Dr. Leslie Williams, and this lecture is the second in marine mammal conservation. In this lecture, we're going to explore some of the landmark U.S. legislation that concerns marine mammal conservation. We'll look at something called units to conserve, so population units versus species, and then finally we'll look at some evolving criteria that actually helps us redefine what a species is. Now, in the late 1960s and early 1970s, the public became increasingly aware of environmental concerns and conservation, in part due to Rachel Carson's landmark book, The Silent Spring. This led to some sweeping changes in legislation, specifically regarding species protection. And there are two landmark pieces of U.S. legislation, the Marine Mammal Protection Act and also the Endangered Species Act, that resulted from this change in public mentality. Now, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, which is the acronym is MMPA, was enacted in 1972, and this basically gave a blanket protection to all marine mammals, regardless of how the marine mammal population was doing. So with limited exceptions for indigenous peoples, such as the Aleuts or the Eskimos, it essentially restricts all killing and even harassment of marine mammals, and of course also restricts their sales or trade of marine mammals or marine mammal parts. Now, the other piece of legislation that's a little broader is called the Endangered Species Act. This was actually enacted in 1973, so 1 year later. And what this does is this basically looks at any species that is considered to be endangered, and endangered means in danger of extinction, or threatened, which is going to be one category lower, which says basically in danger of becoming endangered, so you're not quite to the point where you might go extinct, but you're getting there, and allows the United States to basically come up with a management plan for those species. And interestingly enough, instead of just saying, you know, we're not going to touch that species, you can't harvest that species, it also uses what's called an ecosystem approach, which basically says that we need to also look at the habitat that that species resides in and maintain the health of that ecosystem so that species can thrive and rebound. So the Endangered Species Act is broader than the Marine Mammal Protection Act, but there are some marine mammals that are also included in the Endangered Species Act list because they are either endangered or threatened. Now, what governmental agencies regulate these two landmark pieces of legislation? Now, these are United States specific, the Marine Mammal Protection Act and ESA, and so therefore they are regulated by particular bodies of the governmental agency. Now, for the for the Endangered Species Act, we have basically we break it down into freshwater or terrestrial, and then the marine side of it. If you're in freshwater or terrestrial, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife is going to regulate you, and if you're a marine species, then you use National Marine Fisheries Service. Now, National Marine Fisheries is actually a subdivision of a broader governmental agency called NOAA. And so when we look at the Marine Mammal Protection Act, it turns out that NOAA is actually responsible for almost all the marine mammals with a few exceptions, and those exceptions are the sea otters, the polar bear, and even the sirenians, and also the walrus, which is also a pinniped, and that falls under the jurisdiction of U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So if you have issues with any one species, then you kind of know which government body you need to go to in order to do some type of scientific research on that species, or for example, if you find a stranded whale, you might call NOAA, but if you find a stranded sea otter, you're going to call U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Now, we actually changed from legislation, and we're going to take a look at how legislation is enacted. In other words, what units are we looking to conserve when we're looking at this type of legislation? Now, historically, conservation laws have been aimed at what's called the species level. In other words, you define a species, you determine if is wrong with it, in other words, the species is floundering, and then whether or not you want to put efforts to conserve it. But there's two major problems with this. First and foremost, it doesn't take into account any regional differences in populations. So for example, you may have a population that's actually thriving in one area and floundering in another, and you need to be able to distinguish between them so that you manage your resources prudently. The other issue is that actually, what is a species? For marine mammals especially, particularly the cetaceans, defining the boundary of a species is rather difficult. And so it assumes that you have a well-defined and accurately defined species. We're going to take a look at both of these problems in a little bit more detail, starting with the idea that we need to take into account regional differences. Now, no species demonstrates the need to take into account regions better than the gray whale. What I call the gray whale paradox actually demonstrates very cleanly the need to actually separate out individual populations. So historically, there have been 3 gray whale populations. There's been one in the North Atlantic, which actually went extinct in the 16th and 17th century, probably due to whaling. And now there are 2 Pacific populations. There's the Western Pacific population, which has a number of approximately 120, but no more than likely 130 whales as of 2008. And then there's the Eastern Pacific population, which is found along the coast of the United States. And this has a very healthy number of 18,000 to 20,000 whales. And at one time, actually in the 1990s, it was thought that the population may have even been closer to 29,000, has actually come down a little bit since then to around the 20,000 mark as of 2008. So clearly, this tells us that we can't look at the species as a whole. If we just take a look at all gray whale numbers, we would say the gray whales are doing fine. But that belies the fact that you actually have a strong dichotomy between the 2 populations, and that we need to give the Western Pacific population our full attention for recovery, while the Eastern Pacific population is doing quite well. So this is actually reflected, the fact that there are 2 distinct populations with 2 distinct levels of concern in the listings. When we look at the United States Endangered Species Act, we note that the Eastern Pacific population was actually delisted in 1994, whereas the Western Pacific population is listed as endangered. Now, that's the United States legislation. There is a global list, IUCN, International Union for Conservation of Nature. It was established in 1946, and in 1963 they established something called the Red List. The Red List is a global comprehensive look at how different populations or species are doing, and you can see that the Red List places the Western population at critically endangered, whereas the Eastern population is of what's called least concern, which means we don't even worry about it. So this international agency doesn't really have any jurisdiction or management plan associated with it, but different countries can choose to adopt the information that the IUCN purports as part of their management plan. So with the idea that we need to look beyond just a generic species, let's take a look at some of the structure within a species and how we might go about defining some of that structure. We're going to use a harbor seal as an example. And so what this basically does is demonstrate the idea that the harbor seal has a species name, but it's got a really wide distribution. And so when we look at this, we start looking at different what's called evolutionary significant units, including the fact that we might break it down into a subspecies. There are 2 recognized subspecies found in totally different areas. And then when we look at a subspecies, we move on to what's called a distinct population segment, and then from there we move on to what is called a stock. So this chart right here represents the different structures within a species that we might be concerned about from a conservation standpoint. So just to recap here, A species is going to be basically two groups that are have possibly already speciated, but we don't have enough evidence to support it. However, in practice, this usually means they are geographically separate, and we can see some consistent morphological or genetic differences. So we know that they are well on their way to evolutionary divergence. Distinct population segments are one level below that. They're not quite subspecies, but there is evidence that there's lack of gene flow between the distinct population segments, and they're starting to probably diverge evolutionarily. And then stock is just another word for population, which means that they have the ability to interbreed. The individuals interbreed routinely. So when we look at units to conserve, the Endangered Species Act and the IUCN Red List both allow for conserving beyond species. In other words, you may not want to list a species, you may instead want to look at a subspecies or a distinct population segment. And this gives us some more flexibility with exactly what areas we're trying to manage, and also allows us to be prudent with our resources so we're not over-managing populations that are doing well while under-managing the ones that need some help. All right, and finally we turn to our second issue, which is defining marine mammal species. Now historically, marine mammal species have been defined by their skull anatomy, and this is because the classic definition, the ability to breed and produce viable offspring, is not easy to apply to, for example, a cetacean. The problem is that it requires a lot of skulls, and particularly for our fully aquatic marine mammals, we may not have very many skulls, and so therefore it probably belies the fact that there's more species out there than what we're saying. So recently there's been some evolving criteria for delineating marine mammal species more distinctly. This includes the fact that we're going to look at genetic data. Genetic data basically looks for evidence of a lack of gene flow between two closely related species or populations. If we want to know, are these two distinct species or are they the same species, we'll look there. That gives us some very strong evidence. We might also look at morphometric data analyzed on living individuals, such as fin marking, size, or coloration. We saw that with the orcas in a previous lecture. This can also be very strong evidence when consistent. We look for distinct geographical ranges, which by themselves usually implies they're not interbreeding. This by itself isn't enough to call two populations different species, but it can certainly support other evidence, as well as behavioral differences that suggest they play different roles in the ecosystem. So now that we finished that, we basically come back to some of our conservation trends. Where it used to be the conservation laws were aimed just at looking at a species, we now use distinct population segments and subspecies as options when we're listing under the Endangered Species Act or IUCN. And then also, we understand that skull anatomy is not going to be the end-all for defining species, and that we need to look for some new techniques to try to get a more accurate picture of our true marine mammal diversity. Now that concludes our lecture, and that concludes our series. So I want to thank you very much for watching the series on marine mammal biology. Hopefully you've been able to learn a lot about some of the biological principles and gain an appreciation and understanding for the role that marine mammals play in our world.